Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Molly Dwyer, who is Vice President of Analysis at Predata, part of Fiscal Note, an open source intelligence company based in Washington, D.C. Molly Dwyer, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Molly, will cover what you are observing as the other side of the internet, which sounds really interesting. But before we get into this topic, could we start by just getting your overall comment about our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Well, I think our strategic landscape sort of fits in well to my time at Predata. I've been with the company for just over 7 years now. I was one of the early team members who came in. And really in that time, if you think about the last 7 years, we've really seen that shift from a war on terror mindset to the great power and strategic power competition mode that we are in currently. And honestly, at Predata, we've sort of bent our technology and done development to better assist folks living in this era. If you really think about OSINT tools in the space of, what did you need in a war on terror era, a lot of targeting tools versus what do we need to do now? We need to figure out great powers, what are elites doing? What are they looking at? What are they planning to do? And how are they presenting messages to the whole world? We've sort of developed our tool to fit that mindset now.
Wow, yeah, that is awesome. So, like we said, you're with Predata. Do you think you could give like a 101 to our audience that would be perhaps unfamiliar with what your company is doing? What's the story, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can start by just explaining the term the other side of the internet, which is I think really where we fit into that OSINT landscape. So essentially you have a lot of tools on the market right now, OSINT tools. This is something that our co-founder Josh Hacker noted when he was serving in government, both enlisted and as a civilian, that a lot of the OSINT tools were really focused on what people were saying online. And there were maybe not as many tools that helped you understand what people were doing online, but maybe not actively saying. So probably people like you and me who use the open internet to gather information, but may not necessarily post something publicly or even not publicly in a place where those traditional OSINT tools would capture them. So in that sense, we're really complementary to the other OSINT tools that look at the content of online discussions. We look at sort of that passive side. There was a seminal study done by the Nielsen Group a number of years ago that's been repeated since, called the 1990 rule, that really explains sort of where we fit into that landscape. So what it found was essentially within any given online community, only about 1% of folks are creating new and original content. You've got sort of another 9% of folks who are, liking, commenting, sharing, amplifying that content. But then within online communities, the 90%, most of us are just lurkers online who don't post anything, but we do use the internet to do research. And so that's where Predata fits in, is to capture and quantify that research angle.
And to our audience, we'll get a link to that study that Molly just mentioned and have that available in the show notes. So, I mean, that's fascinating, and it begs additional questions like, I mean, not to get into your proprietary stuff, but how do you do that? How do you make these inferences or collect this data, which is available, but is something that most people are not thinking about?
Yeah, so fundamentally, we're looking at web traffic. So how many views are there to a given web page? what is the content of that web page? So why would someone be visiting it? What language is that web page published in? What time of day are folks accessing it? And our data does go back historically, so you can really make a direct comparison of, say, how many folks visited this web page during this year's iteration of your exercise compared to the same exercise, 3-4 years ago. So you really start to be able to paint a landscape picture of the internet using that web traffic angle.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff, Molly. What kind of use cases are your customers surfacing for you that employs these kinds of insights?
Yeah, so if you think about the way that we use the internet to do research, it really sets us up for two types of research that we can monitor that really align closely to two main use cases. That's proactive research and reactive research. Proactive research, you're trying to get information before you take some sort of action. It could be a kinetic action, like a missile targeting a power plant. It could be your intention to launch a new messaging campaign, or it could even sort of, in our case, be your intention to go buy a new car, but you are leaving likely some sort of breadcrumb on the internet of research before an action takes place. So that corresponds to our traditional sort of indications and warnings use case, sort of a traditional kind of two-component use case. And then on the other side of that, you have reactive research. So something happens in your life, in the news, in the world around you, and you go online to find out more information about a person, place, thing, concept, organization that came up for you. So we can quantify perhaps, which European audience reacted most strongly to the latest big army exercise in Europe, right? We can compare between different audiences by language. We can compare, like I said, historically against each other and really quantify reactions in a way that is complementary to the tools that you see in the traditional OSINT space looking at content online. So that's where we sort of get into more of a measures of effectiveness, where we can slot into that IO toolkit as opposed to a measures of performance.
So, back up to some comments that you were making just a few moments ago from this, big transition from the, war on terror mindset to great power competition. I've thought about that same kind of a transition, and it's happening, globally. But let's just stick to the United States and its national security community, right? Going from this kinetic kill, immediate gratification kind of a mindset to this continual competition, campaigning mindset. So that transition is happening as we speak, right? And there are people who have been operating in the government and national security space for like 40 years with still with a Cold War mindset, and then this war on terror mindset, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that was kind of like a rambling lead into how are you engaging with your current and prospective customers along those lines in order to convince them that this is the kind of tool that would be appropriate for today's problem sets?
Yeah, well, we've really been still trying to educate the marketplace that PAI and OSINT doesn't need to automatically mean social media or sort of only social media, that there is this other side of the internet in web traffic that you can capture. And what that means is that, like I said, we're not a targeting tool, but we can help you see broader strategic trends. So for example, which government leaders in Oceania are getting the most research online from people who do their research in Mandarin? That is sort of a big strategic question, right? But it does have sort of real discrete outcomes that could come from it. So it's sort of a challenge within educating that marketplace of PI OSINT is not just social media. These are broader types of questions that you can ask, but then it becomes a challenge of how do you fit that into your existing reporting structures? If you have someone who's convinced of this approach, are they able to, change the requirements? Are they able to slot this into what they're doing in a way that it actually makes it up their chain of command? Recently, we were just at an industry event talking to someone from the Army, from big OSINT office, asking sort of what were some of the challenges that we've seen when we start to get into contracts or trial periods, or just generally working within the community. And I would have to say, one thing that I told him in response was sort of this, there is, I think, top-down pressure to innovate and try new approaches and get that competitive advantage. And I think that there is enthusiasm from analysts on the line. I think there's maybe a bit of a missing middle. Like I said, sort of changing the things on paper, the requirements themselves, how you're training folks to really make an incentive to try new things. Sort of if many technology companies would agree that if you sort of just drop a tool into a unit, ask them to play around with it, that's maybe not necessarily setting either side up for success. We tend to see our most successful customer use cases when folks come in sort of really willing to talk about how this is going to fit into their workflow, how they're going to, set a requirement for, okay, we've assessed the content, we've assessed the, measure of performance. We're going to slot in here to think about what is the angle, the research angle, the other side of the internet angle, the web traffic angle. And fundamentally, that's where we see shifts in our customer uses. Yeah.
Right. We had a great discussion that is, I would say, adjacent, related to the kinds of things that you guys are doing there at Predata, Molly, with a gentleman named Elliot Jardines. And he is a OSINT expert, I think, who has been aimed at these same kinds of customer education challenges from his perspective, from within the intelligence. Anyway, we'll have a link to his discussion in the show notes as well, so for people to check out other OSINT related topics. But so what have you guys discovered about the importance of messaging and counter messaging, and how does your technology feed into those kinds of capabilities?
Yeah, so I can give you one messaging example and one counter messaging example. So sort of very classically, we were working with some folks looking at, here are some different actions that the US has taken in the Indo-Pacific to try to advance our narrative, putting things out sort of in the traditional way on social media, on Twitter, videos out, and not really seeing much of a reaction online. And we went to take a look at the Predata angle. So are people changing their research behavior online in reaction to the messaging that you're putting out and in reaction to the actions that you're taking? But maybe we're just not seeing that reflected in likes, comments, or shares on social media. And what we actually saw was there was something like a 2,000% increase in the number of views to a page that was in Vietnamese on freedom of navigation. So they were actually being more effective than they realized. They just weren't necessarily looking in the right place to get that measurement. And I think on the idea of counter messaging, this is something that I really enjoy digging into with my background as Russia Asia SME. But looking at, for example, Europe, when
do you
French
think
president,
do you think, Molly, that you could give just like a quick little 101 on what is the difference between messaging and counter messaging for people in our audience that might not be familiar with what that actually means?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, forgive me, I'm not an IO professional. I just support our IO professionals. But from my understanding, so messaging is when we are advancing US narratives. So generally speaking, that we are a good and reliable global partner. And counter messaging is really trying to figure out what is the right message back when our adversaries are either putting out narratives that inflate themselves or that put the US down as a global partner. And that's sort of an exhaustive task. You really can't hit back at all messaging at all times. And that's really why measures of effectiveness are so important. You really only for the sake of resources, can focus on combating the narratives that are actually influencing folks the most. You don't need to waste your time trying to combat narratives that maybe might be inflated by trolls online, but that are not really actually influencing people to change their online research behavior. That's where we fit in. And particularly within counter messaging, different narratives may land differently with different local populations. So the example I was going to cite was, when French President Macron went to Beijing, there was a lot of concern about how do we counter message in Europe that, the US is a better partner for European states than China is. But that's a bit of an exhaustive task. There are how many dozens of languages spoken and specific national circumstances in Europe. One thing that you can do with our tool is check to see, okay, well, by language, which European audience, had the biggest jump in their attention to sort of positive China themes, and perhaps had a neutral or a drop off in their research to negative themes related to China. And that allows you to zero in on maybe who would be really worth the effort to focus our counter messaging efforts on.
Would you say it's fair that your technology doesn't tell your customers like what to say, but it identifies opportunities for them to say it?
Exactly. Like I said, I've been at this for 7 years now, so we've really done a lot of product development based around what we've heard from our users, particularly our early users. And what we've seen is an appetite for more data, but that still allows the analysts to be analysts, to come to their own conclusions, to make their own decisions. We give you better data in order to figure that out.
Yeah. So cool. So what are some of the use cases that, or the kinds of questions that your clients are asking and that you're helping them answer?
Yeah, well, I'll stick to sort of the information operations side, since I think that's probably what's closest at hand here for your listeners.
Sure, yeah.
But it can be as small as, my unit is doing an exercise. I would like to advance these narratives during the exercise, or maybe I would even just like to know if anyone is researching the units that are participating in this exercise, whether it's local audiences or whether it's adversaries who might be taking an unusual interest. So that's at the hyper kind of tactical level. And then zooming all the way out, back to some of the earlier examples I referenced, we can sort of look at that 30,000-foot view of, looking at research from people who speak Russian to security forces in Africa. Where is most of the research focused in the last week? How has that changed over time? All the way to on the narrative side, where should the US be focusing its counter messaging efforts in the coming month, right? We can fit into both that 30,000-foot view and that more tactical unit based view.
Right. So several years ago, I don't know, maybe the 2017, 2018 timeframe, there was a famous incident. I'm probably not going to get it exactly right, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about. But there was a I don't know, Russia was making inferences about like NATO troop activity in, I don't know, Finland or Norway, based upon like cell phone signals that the NATO soldiers had on them, right? And it was something like Russia put out some kind of like a false information about something happening within the homeland, and then all of a sudden the cell phone signals like lit up where all of the NATO troops were operating or something like that. But you're taking that kind of a signal, but you're using different data to pick up those kinds of signals and then making inferences about what's happening. that was really clumsy, but am I directionally accurate at least with that?
I think you are. We can give you an insight into what our adversary groups researching. Should they know about your unit or your exercise, or would they have any knowledge from the public domain to go look up an obscure town where you know that you're about to send folks? So from an operational security standpoint, you can monitor to see if, there are eyes on you before there should be eyes on you. We can also give you a sense of, local populations in a similar way of, are there eyes on this area before there should be based on what's already in the public domain.
I can imagine that, like right now, and by the way, to our audience, for those that are listening a couple of years from now, we're recording this in late September 2023. But so as of right now, late September 2023, I would imagine that the kinds of analyses that you're doing are really effective, because many people globally are not considering these kinds of, like, I don't know, digital footprints, and how these digital footprints can be parlayed into these, really valuable insights that you guys are providing. But maybe 10 years from now or 20 years from now, people are going to start becoming more savvy to their own digital exhaust. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of, I don't know, almost like an arms race, or kind of like a cat and mouse game, as people start either camouflaging or disguising, or otherwise obscuring their activities online, so that the kinds of analyses that you guys are doing also have to be adapted? Is that the kind of thing that you guys ever talk about at the water cooler?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that we do get often in demos is, I use a VPN. The people that we're
Yeah,
looking use a
yeah.
VPN. So how are you able to do this? So that's why we take a bit more of that 30,000 foot view approach. So we
Uh-huh.
are not collecting any data on individual user browsing, which again is why we're not a targeting tool. It also
Mm,
means that we don't run into any GDPR issues, and we don't run into any issues about collecting on US persons, but we still can give you an insight into, as a whole, an audience that looks like an American audience. What are they researching, right? Without running
mm,
into those issues. Because we're just looking at the views on pages. We're looking at what language is someone reading a page in. We're looking at, what time of day, sort of by the hour, are these views concentrated? Does that line up with, someone who is located in the Western Hemisphere, or someone in a different time zone, sort of in average working day hours? So
mhm.
we're sort of have an eye on that. And it's one of the reasons why we in our product development have sort of gone down the angle of giving our users more contextual information about the web traffic patterns that we're seeing,
Mm,
without taking necessarily a strong targeting argument of exactly who is behind that. Sort of
yeah,
staying at the information level helps
yeah.
us get around that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And something else that I've been hearing lately, and I'm curious if this also resonates with you guys, is using these kinds of tools, which are fueled by publicly available information, or PAI, is really helpful in that the data products that you guys are producing are shareable across the geopolitical landscape with our partners and allies. Is that something else that is like a major tick mark in the plus column for your technology?
Absolutely. So whether it's sort of on that I&W side or on the information operations side, we have seen that where, folks may jump into our platform to maybe try to confirm something that they've seen elsewhere. And then they sort of find a nexus or an explanation in that shareable space in our platform that then they can pass to our partners.
Yeah. So far we have not mentioned artificial intelligence. Could you talk a little bit about how AI is woven into your technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So our parent company, FiscalNote, was actually one of the early partners selected by OpenAI to really kick off integrating use of their models into all of the platforms across the FiscalNote product suite. But specifically in Predata, we do have an AI-enabled function right now. Where we have found it helpful with our users is that they're not necessarily an expert in everything. And it would traditionally take a bit of research to figure out, what are these narratives? How do I break them down into discrete categories? Or, I would like to monitor this whole swath of infrastructure in a country. That's going to take me a lot of time to gather all of those web pages and bring them into Monitor. So that's where we're seeing AI fit in right now to our toolkit, is to help our users, our analysts, be more effective more quickly. But generally speaking, AI in, I think, the landscape of information operations, I think a very clear answer is that our adversaries are going to be able to even more rapidly deploy narratives, try out different narratives, generate, you know, content to back these things up. And it's going to become even more of a whack-a-mole game than it already is to figure out what is actually worth our time and resources to counter message against. And I think that is where, you really need tools like ours that allow you to understand, okay, of these, 40,000 new pieces of content that include, deep fake AI videos and all of these other, sources, which ones are actually reaching real people, and which ones do we need a message against? And actually, further on that point about AI, I think I referenced the metaphor earlier of taking this oceanic view of looking for shifting tides in online research. But if you think about boiling the ocean, that's a lot of information for our users, for analysts in general, that they have to take in. So I think another application of AI can be, automating the analysts and allowing them to be more effective with their time. So, not needing to care about every shifting data point, but the ones that AI is automatically detecting as, the most relevant, the most outside of other news contexts, that also may help them sort of summarize things, right? I mean, the large language models are quite good at taking information in and synthesizing it. You need that human in the loop. You need that analyst with the final call on what's going on. But to be able to surface the bits of information that are likely to be the most impactful, the most quickly, for analysts is something that we're excited to incorporate into our platform.
That is so cool. So cool. You guys are really operating in a really interesting, awesome space there. I'd like to do a quick lightning round, if we may, Molly, and then we can start wrapping things up. So first lightning round, metadata.
It's the backbone of our platform. It's what we look at. We look at views to pages. And we, like I said, we don't run into the maybe GDPR issues or US persons issues, because we're really kind of standing at the corner of a web page with a view counter, seeing who comes by.
Okay. Black box.
We are not one. We try to give our users as much information as possible, down to the actual number of views, down to the views by the hour. Like I said, we sort of feed a lot of data and let our analysts make their own decisions.
So I've got a couple of typical wrap-up questions that I like to ask our guests, Molly. So the first is, we've got a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Do you think you could offer a fruitful research question that's related to the kinds of things that we've been discussing?
Yeah, definitely. I think something around what we have sort of informally started calling INW for IO. So can we identify early signals or breadcrumbs online or in other environments that folks are researching that give an early indication before there's a shift in messaging or before a new message starts to goes out from our adversaries. So if you think about, for example, the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, when Russia's messaging sort of very quickly in a matter of days and weeks shifted from security concerns to sort of broader existential stakes of Ukrainian nationhood and its own history. Where can we see early indicators before that messaging started to shift publicly?
Cool. Do you guys at Predata actually work with students, or like let's say that a student is listening to this right now and they've got some energy and the resources to examine this kind of challenge. Is that something that a student could actually engage with you on in order to study this topic more?
Absolutely. We have worked with researchers at universities before, researchers internal to organizations. So please go to predata.com, contact us. We would love to help you answer your research question.
Yeah, cool. And then finally, what's a good book or other online resource that is either related to the kinds of things that you guys are doing, or alternatively, it could just be what's on your nightside table right now?
I think the thing that keeps me up at night, and this could speak to the amount of time that I've spent living in Russia, is really sort of the ability of the U.S. to articulate on a global stage and to articulate on a local stage sort of the power of democracy and a rules-based international order and a rule of law-based society. I think our ability to act as a global partner is only as good as our ability to articulate that. This sort of roar of authoritarianism is something that's fascinated me as a research question, going back to my university days. So I actually have a book from Anne Applebaum on my nightstand right now that I've been trying to slowly make it through, that I think speaks to, again, when you think about these challenges that the US is facing at a global scale, a lot of that nexus, a lot of those battleground conversations go back to Russia, go back to Ukraine, and she's a scholar from that historical area. But it's called The Twilight of Democracy that I'm reading from her, about how does authoritarianism sort of creep into conversations and how does that make appeals. I think that messaging for us is really key to understand.
Yeah, and great suggestion. I've not read that book. Would like to put that on my list as well. And a couple of previous guests have actually suggested that that Anne Applebaum would make a great guest for this forum. So if anybody knows her, would be delighted to get a introduction. So, wow. Well, this has been fantastic, Molly, and you and your colleagues there at Predata are doing amazing work on behalf of the free world, really. Definitely wish you and your colleagues Godspeed as you continue doing this fantastic work. And with that, Molly Dwyer, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.